Dear viewers, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh. First, I would like to welcome all of you to the second webinar held by Emirates Policy Center in Abu Dhabi on the ramification of coronavirus. The webinar live streamed on EPC account on all various social media platforms and the center's YouTube channel. Just I will talk in Arabic just to explain something. Down you will find like on the banner down you have like a ball. Here there is what it say language. المستمعين باللغة العربية في أسفل الصفحة هناك خيار مثل الكرة الأرضية، إذا ضغطتم عليها يعطيك خيارين الإنجليزي والفرنسي English and French. لمن يودون الاستماع باللغة العربية يرجى الضغط على French. هناك يستطيعون الاستماع إلى هذه الندوة باللغة العربية. The first webinar discussed potential global geostrategic shifts of the coronavirus crisis. This webinar deals with the potential post-corona virus geopolitical shifts in the MENA region. We are honored to have with us this webinar two renowned scholars and researchers. The first is Dr. Paul Salem, President of the Middle East Institute in Washington, and the second is Dr. Robert Satloff, Executive Director of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. We are also honored to have Dr. Zaid Eyadat, Director of the Center for Strategic Studies at the University of Jordan. With me, Ebtesam Al Ketbi, the President of Emirates Policy Center, as moderators of this webinar. Before I give the floor to speakers, I would like to say that since this pandemic spread in the world and turned into a global crisis, there have been many literature that try to analyze the impact of the corona crisis on the international order, the competition between major powers, the global economy and globalization and other aspects. Among the issues that these efforts tried to analyze and make predictions about was the consequences of coronavirus crisis on the regional order, including the MENA region, where there are ongoing wars and conflicts, particularly in Libya, Syria, and Yemen. Of course, not to mention that political turmoil, power vacuum, and instability have recently plagued the region in particular. Therefore, EPC organized this webinar in an attempt to foresee the post-coronavirus world in our region and come up with answers to the question that was, we asked both Dr. Paul and Dr. Satloff, whom I would like to thank for accepting the center invitation to take part in this significant event. I would like to welcome you all once again and wish all viewers of this live stream sessions on EPC account on all various social media platforms and the center's YouTube channel fruitful and beneficial discussion. Now, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Satloff to give us a short statement on his view the impact of corona crisis on the MENA region. Please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ebtesam, and it's a pleasure to join you and to join my old friend, Paul Salem, on this very important webinar. First, I think it's important for all of us to note some humility. We are very much at the beginning. If we're going to be trying to look into the distant future about the impact on the Middle East, North Africa region, we're still at the very beginning of this crisis. If this were the Great Depression, it's still only 1930. If this were World War II, it's still only 1942. If this were after 9/11, we're still in late 2001. We can't yet foresee the second, third, fourth order repercussions of what's going on. So I think some humility is in order. Secondly, just a quick word on the big global question. I am personally much less concerned about China stealing a march on America through disinformation, lying about the origin of the virus, and sending defective PPE to countries around the world, than I am about a vacuum of global leadership. And here, the key variable is in America. It is not in China. It is not in Europe. It's here in the United States. Will our national takeaway be the post-World War I takeaway of isolationism, or the post-World War II takeaway of internationalism? It's a fundamental choice. I think for the balance of the Trump administration, and if there's a second Trump administration, the choice is rather clear. I think it's it's murkier. It's not as clear if the Democrats win in November. Remember, it was Barack Obama who once said, we have to do nation building at home. And that was when we had a strong economy. Now, with a weak economy, there will be forces pulling in both directions, even within the Democratic Party. We can't so be sure that the direction of a Biden administration will take us. Now, in the Middle East, some have suggested that the coronavirus pandemic changes everything. My hunch is that is not correct. My view is it doesn't change everything. It accelerates and exaggerates trends that are already underway. And those major trends are heightened nationalism, less regional cooperation, and less transnational financial support. I think we already are seeing governments and peoples turning more inward, taking care of themselves, making sure they can produce their own face masks and gowns, they can produce their own food, so they don't have to rely on imports. I think there's going to be a doubling down of that emphasis on taking care of one's own. We're already seeing governments, even governments that are having very severe problems with the virus. We're seeing it not affect some of their underlying strategies. So Iran, for example, remains undeterred in its regional project, despite the enormous human cost of the virus, seeking to expand its influence in the Gulf, in Iraq, and throughout the Levant. We're seeing even in a country like Israel, dealing heavily with this virus, dealing even with renewed fear of an Iranian nuclear program. We're seeing the Israeli political leadership still focus on a question like annexation, which you would imagine, would not be the topic that would be high on the agenda if the country was changing course to deal with the post-corona world. Conflicts, Libya, Yemen, still remain ongoing, despite the international call for ceasefire. This is not to say that COVID has no impact. I've yet to see, I think, the full impact in three types of areas: dense urban zones, Cairo, Alexandria, Algiers, Casablanca; refugee zones, northern Syria, southern Turkey, parts of Sudan; foreign worker camps in key parts of the Gulf. I think we have yet to see the real full impact, especially in those sorts of zones. I think there's going to be a considerable tension between countries that don't have a good formula for health system, public security, social cohesion, and money that will lubricate all the problems, and especially those countries that are so reliant on oil income and don't have an alternative source in this era of the oil collapse, which was a double whammy hitting right at the moment of the corona crisis. So just to conclude, I think, some countries will be okay. We're already seeing Lebanon implode. I'm personally very concerned about Iraq, Algeria, and Egypt. And then just more generally, my view is COVID doesn't change everything. It accentuates and exaggerates trends that have already begun to deeply affect the region's political setup.
Thank you, Rob. Uh, Paul, please, can you give us also your view on this?
Yeah, thank you. أولا, a few words in Arabic. مساء الخير ورمضان كريم للجميع. And thank you, Dr. Ebtesam, for convening this webinar. Thank you, Dr. Zaid. And also, it's great to see my old friend, Robert Satloff. And I agree with a lot of what he said. And let me begin on a similar vein, that COVID teaches us humility in a number of ways. One of which is the issue of predictability. Other than the fact that indeed we are at the beginning of a crisis, it might go in many different directions. There could be a somewhat positive scenario where therapies are found quickly and there's a way to manage it and we begin to get back to normal by the end of 2020. But there's also scenarios where, as Robert indicated, this proceeds maybe gradually, but unchecked and hits big urban areas and poor areas where you cannot do social distancing, where people cannot stay home in some of the more populated countries of the Middle East. And that could create a scenario of not hundreds of thousands, but millions dead, and could create enormous social and political instability. We see some inklings of that in Lebanon, although it's a slightly different, complex situation with other economic and political variables. But we really don't know how things are going. The other aspect of humility, and this relates to foreign policy institutes like yours, the Emirates Policy Center, and ours, and so on, is that the COVID crisis reminds us how unpredictable major events are. And as much as we convene meetings like this to try to predict, we all have to be aware that the future is unpredictable. And hence the emphasis should be more on resilience, on ability to absorb shocks and blows, regardless of where they come from, rather than trying to predict what's going to happen. Now, that might be one of the benefits of the COVID crisis, that it shows us how vulnerable our economies are, where are the sectors that need to be made most resilient, where are the areas where we don't want to be over-dependent on sources that could disappear, what are the social sectors that are most vulnerable, the poor, the displaced, women certainly, young people who are unemployed. So how do we learn from this crisis to build societies and economies and states that are resilient and that can withstand this shock, but more importantly, other shocks that might come down the road. Now, on the things that we might be able to look at, and I want to begin with the sort of US and the international order, because that has a huge impact on the Middle East. A few things that we can probably predict, regardless of the details of how this emerges, is that, first of all, the world economy will be contracted, will be much smaller than it was a few months ago. It might take several years to recover to the levels it was at 2019. I think we can also predict that the levels of trade and globalization will be more limited and more restricted than they were in 2019. And I believe we can also predict that demand for hydrocarbons will remain quite limited for the next 2 to 3 years. Those three things by themselves have a huge impact on the Gulf in particular, given how much its economies are interconnected with demand and supply in the global economy. As relates to the US itself, and the US is the main security provider for the Gulf, I believe it will remain the main security provider, but as Dr. Satloff indicated, the US will be very, very concerned, and US public, regardless of who wins the White House in November of this year, Americans are overwhelmingly concerned with their jobs, their livelihood, their health. The economy has taken a beating. no White House and no Congress in 2021 or 2022 will be able to finance any major sort of adventures or any major commitments outside the US. I don't think that would mean a US withdrawal from the Middle East, no, but I think it will continue the process that we saw from President Obama to President Trump, in which the Middle East is less and less important. It doesn't disappear from importance, but it is declining in importance. I would indicate that the collapse of the US energy market, which is a huge problem for the Republican administration, in particular President Trump and the Republicans in Congress, unfortunately was linked to actions by Saudi Arabia and the price war that it triggered with Saudi Arabia. So there is a new problem in US Gulf relations, that there is a faction now which blames the collapse of the energy sector, some of it, not the entire collapse, on actions taken by Saudi Arabia in particular, and that will be a problem in relations moving forward. So the US will remain engaged, but the engagement will be very, very limited and not proactive at all. The international order, as it relates to the Middle East, was already in 2016 and moving forward a multipolar international order. The US was present, but Russia had come back and China was coming in a big way. The UN Security Council does not exist as a functioning institution. There is no managed international order. Even if Joe Biden became the president of the United States, and he is an internationalist and multilateralist, I don't think there is a capacity to go back to the old days where the US really played a leadership role and was able to manage some kind of global order. So the Middle East countries are going to have to manage in an international order, which is in a way less interested in them because energy is less interesting, less interested on the security front because most countries are protecting themselves through homeland security rather than hoping to win wars in the Middle East. So we might be a bit left to our own. The two other things that might be predictable in some sense, one is the domestic impact of the coronavirus in the Middle East. Definitely, this virus is causing an enormous contraction in the economies of the region. In many countries, it will lead to an enormous rise in the levels of unemployment and in poverty. Some countries, like those in the Gulf, have a cushion. They maybe can manage this. But many other countries, similar to the ones mentioned by Dr. Satloff, obviously the big, Egypt, Algeria, Morocco, and some other troubled countries like Yemen and Lebanon and so on, will not be able to manage it. That brings the risk of social instability, security instability, pressures on state stability, the risk of revolt and state collapse, similar to what happened in 2011 and in 2019 in some countries. And that means that the Middle East might be an even more explosive place than it was in the last decade. And that's something that the countries in the region, the more dominant ones, whether it's Saudi Arabia, UAE, and others in the Gulf, or Turkey, Iran, Israel, will have to contend with. I think I will conclude that this crisis, which is maybe the biggest health and economic crisis since World War II, since the Great Depression, since World War I and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, it is a big, big, big historic crisis. I agree that if leaders don't pivot and don't read sort of the lessons of this crisis, they could continue with business as usual, with continued lack of cooperation in the Middle East, continued proxy conflict and proxy war. I would definitely think that's the wrong direction to go. This crisis indicates that we're all in this together. This virus does not respect borders. It cannot be fought in one country without fighting it in another. And I would hope that some leaders in the region would change their behavior and move towards a more cooperative approach to common regional problems. And I'll stop there. Sorry, we can't. There we go.
Dr. Zaid, please.
Thank you, Dr. Sam. Well, Paul and Rob, one can hope for no better opening remarks. This is fantastic, provocative and challenging. I'm not sure I'm personally agree on most of what you've said. Well, I agree on most of them, but not all of them. But I will reflect very quickly on some of the ideas and that you already have introduced, which I'm taken by the idea of humility, and I think this is a common thing that we have a human being we have to share and think of, despite all our arrogance, thinking that we can do anything. As a tiny, small virus just brought us all in quarantine and lockdown and isolation. So it's about time to rethink our own existence, if you wish, if we're going to go beyond even the politics of it. But the very idea of our existence as a human being needs to be rethought. Well, that aside, I would like to bring you more close to home and to look at these accelerated, exaggerated trends, Rob, you've been talking about, and about the domestic impact, Paul, that you've introduced of Corona on the Middle East. So in a way, we know just, the day before Corona, business was as usual since ever. Despite the fact we've been warning as political scientists and scholars and decision makers and think tanks that will look, the Middle East regime as we knew it after the Cold War has already collapsed. And there is a need for a new regional system. Business continued as usual with regional rivalries and interstate conflicts and within the state conflicts. So this is the perfect storm for the Middle East, where this coronavirus came into a time where countries were already suffering. So in that sense, in the power balancing issue, in the geostrategic competition with the power in the Middle East, and I pick 4 big countries, and you can add more. I would like to look at Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. Now, one can throw in Egypt, and some people can think of Morocco or Algeria. So what's going to happen to these countries in terms of these regional competitions for hegemony? This is one. And the second issue is, this is for Paul. Well, the question is for both of you, by the way, but particularly the domestic impact and the idea of political stability. So we've been introduced to trinity of poverty, famine, and unemployment. To quote the words of His Majesty King Abdullah in his article in the Washington Post 2 days ago. So how would that play? The floors for both of you. We'll start with Rob.
Well, look, you asked me about 4 different countries, Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. I made a couple of brief comments about 2 of these countries in my remarks, about Iran and Israel. I think it's absolutely fascinating that Iran, which is suffering perhaps the worst of this pandemic of any country in the region, seems to have had 0 impact on what it has been trying to do in Iraq or Lebanon or Yemen or in its nuclear program. Which continues to bust through the JCPOA limitations. Now, whether there's the type of response that we would have had beforehand, that's a different question. But I think the observation is that the corona has had no impact on this aspect of Iranian national policy. Similarly with the Turks are now operating in Libya, which is remarkable under any circumstance when one thinks about it, but especially remarkable so under the current circumstance. I say the same thing that about Israeli politics, which I would have thought would have put aside some of the political issues regarding the future disposition of the West Bank in order to focus solely on the national emergency government's mandate to address coronavirus. But no, It's actually an early issue that will be on the cabinet's agenda if this government, in fact, is formed. Will be on this cabinet's agenda in just a couple of months, in July 1st. In Saudi Arabia, I think this is only going to accelerate a process that we've seen in the last couple of years of the growing power of Saudi nationalism, of Saudi Arabia moving from an approach which emphasized, broader Islamic pan-Arab support to taking care of Saudi Arabia. Yes, Saudi Arabia will still have a foreign policy, don't get me wrong, but the urgency of finding a solution for the conundrum of Saudi economics and Saudi demography, it became 10 times worse in the last 6 weeks because of the oil price collapse. And the idea that the Saudis, what people tend to forget is this: in order to achieve 2030, Saudis need money. 2030 requires significant investment. And that investment, sources of that investment are now dwindling. And so the pressure is on. And that will refocus, doubling down on the need for the Saudi Arabia to take care of Saudi Arabians first. That changes what our conventional view of Saudi Arabia and its role in the region. I think that's how I look at these 4 countries and how they are how they've reacted to this virus by not changing some of the key elements of their national security policy.
Okay. If you allow me,
thank
زيد التنويه للأخوة المتابعين الذين يودون الاستماع إلى الحديث باللغة العربية. يوجد هناك في أسفل الشاشة زر يشير إلى اللغة. من يرغب في الاستماع إلى الحديث باللغة العربية فليضغط على الفرنسية الفرنش، ومن يريد استمرار في السماع باللغة الإنجليزية فليبقيه على الإنجليش. Sorry, Dr. Zaid.
No problem. Thank you. So, Rob, thank you very much. This is elaborated.
I'd like to comment as well on that. Yeah, to comment on that aspect as well.
Yes.
I mean, it's very hard, obviously, to predict what particular leaders will do. At the end, they are sort of personal and political decisions, and leadership matters. But I do think that the pressures created by this crisis, and particularly if we play it out many months down the road, keep in mind we're only in the first few weeks of a crisis that, at least economically, will be measured in years, not in weeks. The pressure that creates in all countries is very much towards attention to domestic priorities. That is going to be the case in Turkey. It's going to be the case in Iran. Obviously, it's the case in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere. It is the case in the United States as well. Now, that does not automatically mean that a leader facing pressure to prioritize issues at home will automatically, change their foreign policy. But I do think that we can look towards a dynamic in which regional conflict might not be resolved, but I think we could hope to see less billions of dollars or less hundreds of millions of dollars being spent in adventures abroad and in other countries. I do also think that it creates an opportunity. Again, this is for leaders to take advantage, whether leaders in the region or some form of global leadership, to take advantage of this economic contraction to attempt to negotiate an end to some of the conflicts in the region. There are very vigorous attempts to end the conflict in Yemen. A lot of progress has been made. Those efforts need to continue to get to a resolution. A lot of efforts in Libya as well. Those efforts need to continue. Maybe Syria is a far more complex and more intractable conflict, but there is an opportunity there. I would also indicate that much of the major conflict in the region is partly a conflict between the US on one side and Iran on the other. This goes back, of course, almost 40 years to 1979, but was hugely aggravated by the invasion of Iraq, invasion of Afghanistan, and the George W. Bush administration, to the degree that it becomes clear that the U.S. is really turning inwards, and to the degree that the U.S. can have a vigorous and impactful diplomacy, maybe with the Biden administration, to have a tough negotiation with Iran, one that would end permanently its nuclear program, but also effectively negotiate a de-escalation and disentanglement of Iran from the region. So I always go back to what are the opportunities for leadership, what are the opportunities for diplomacy to make a change in our part of the world, and I think change is possible. On some of the domestic issues, Dr. Zaid, that you mentioned, it's interesting that there's kind of a contradictory dynamic. On one hand, this crisis has strengthened central governments because they can command shutdowns, they can surveil the population, and people kind of accept it for a while because you have to do it, because it's for health reasons. And it forces people to go home. It's harder to protest on the streets. And it kind of puts a pause on civil society and political action and protest. So there are different dynamics there. This could lead to much more repressive, much more centralized governments with much more surveillance legitimized by this crisis. Or it could continue the dynamic which we've had for the last 30 years in the Arab countries, which is authoritarian governments which are very repressive, but create such a reaction from the public that leads to sudden eruptions, sudden protests, and risk to the stability of the state. Again, we see maybe the beginnings of that in Lebanon, but since people cannot stay home for months, people need to eat, people need to go around, and there is no political space for people to express themselves. And I fear that as the states get even more repressive, it will lead to even more disruptive eruptions.
Well, thank you very much, both of you. Dr. Ebtesam, I'll take it back to you, but I have so many points to raise and react to. So I'll just take it back to you now.
Okay. Also, Paul, you have mentioned on what you have saying that that might be some of eruption will come. So, what do you think that will we see more or second wave or third wave of protesting? I don't know what you will name it, especially those countries whom they will have, I mean, it will be complicated, a crisis, financial crisis, social crisis, and of course, health crisis. Would this lead to more crisis, double crisis in these countries, of more protestation against, we'll see a second wave? I won't call it spring, I would call it this time, it might be winter or autumn. How do you view it?
Yeah, well, I do think that no doubt it's going to lead to some forms of eruption, because in some of the countries, because with rapidly rising levels of hunger, well, poverty, unemployment, and hunger, and an economic contraction that we haven't seen for many, many years, people will not be able to sustain that, will not be able to bear it. What I fear is that the protest movements, let's say of 2011 or even 2019, were in a way by political choice. They had, certain groups, many of them led by young people with political ideas, calling for certain types of, understandable political change. But I fear that the types of protests that we might see in the months ahead are really explosions of hunger and like hunger riots, eruptions of immense desperation in particularly heavily urban and very poor areas, without having that sort of political objectives and mobilization and so on. And that might make them much more difficult to deal with because they're much more desperate. I know that many of the governments of the region are aware of this and trying to get ahead of that wave by rapidly expanding their social safety nets, by trying to be present in terms of services and cash transfers in areas. I know the Egyptian government is doing a lot. I know other governments are doing as well. But this crisis is moving so rapidly and in ways that we haven't seen before that I'm not sure we will be able to contain it.
All right, thank you, Paul. If you allow, Dr. Sam. Well, look, it's really complicated, and although you just mentioned that it's hard to predict the future, we all try to predict the future because there's no better business than trying to come up with some scenarios that at least show us some paths, some lights, so we can make decision out of it. So I will take what you have said and just combine them with what Rob tried to say as well, and ask Rob, if you don't mind, about the issues that the people of the region care most about. And I will talk first about regional power competitions or rivalries. What are the futures for that? Now we keep saying, well, giving the significance, the long-last impact of this crisis on the domestic politics in the region, and leaders should do this and that, but we know leaders go and do what they used to do, looking at their national interests very narrowly, and trying at the same time just to survive. So it is a very complicated game that they are playing. So if I take that and see how that will impact, shape or reshape the regional power competition, like also Rob to reflect on that. The other issue would be the Arab-Palestinian, the Israeli-Palestinian issues, the deal of the century and the annexation that is taking place now. And the other issues is the conflict zones in the countries. I'm referring to Syria in particular, Libya and Yemen, and the future of Egypt, given all of this. I know this is a lot to digest and react to, but at least through, some food for thought.
Well, my first comment is you asked to focus on the issues that matter most to people. And I would humbly suggest that none of these are the issues that matter most to people, which doesn't make them unimportant, but they're just not the ones that matter most. Now, the ones that matter most to people are food on the table, roof on the head, job to go to, health of my family, school for my kids, that sort of thing. Now, those issues are now all up for grabs in many countries. Those, what we call in America, those bread and butter issues are now up for grabs, and uncertainty is, I think, this is the regional norm. Uncertainty in wealthy countries, uncertainty in poor countries. And so I think leaders are taking a much closer look at the pulse of their people on these issues than they've done in a very long time. There's just there's a lot less money in the system, in everybody's system, in order to lubricate the difficulties. And people, I think, are less likely to allow themselves to be distracted by those foreign adventures or those ideological choices that leaders might have tried to use in the old days to avoid dealing with some of these bread and butter issues. Which, again, it's not to suggest that those issues that you listed are not important, but when I wake up in the morning, if I'm the king of X or president of Y, I think I'm first and foremost asking my mukhabarat chief, are there food riots? Are there bread crisis? Are people protesting because of those sorts of issues?
Rob, I'm sorry, Rob. Let me interrupt you for a second. I certainly and 100% agree with you. I mean, these are the most important personal issues for people and leaders today. because of what is happening. And it might continue to be the most important things for the coming months or maybe year or so. But at the very end, what I'm talking about, the geostrategic changes, I'm trying to identify and list the most pressing issues for the countries, for the states, for the players, because whether we having a crisis of this magnitude or we don't, these are the geostrategic challenges that are facing the countries and the governments and the people of the region. We're talking about regional power competition. We're talking about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict or deal of the century, and we're talking about the conflict zones, and we're talking about the future of Egypt. These are, determinantal to the future of the region. You know it more than I do. So although the other issues are the most pressing issues today, but at the long-term geostrategic shifts, I would like to pick up your brain and see what you think of the possible impacts, changes, alteration on these issues.
Yeah. So, just very, very, very briefly, I think the Iran challenge still dominates. It dominates most countries in the region. It dominates. Not in the far west of the region, but certainly in the Levant and the Gulf, in Israel, it dominates in Washington, and even dominates in many European capitals. They may disagree with the United States on the specifics of the JCPOA, but they agree with the United States, even this administration, on almost every other aspect of analytically in terms of what the Iranians are doing. The real challenge here is to figure out a common approach. Now, I think this is going to be a much hotter issue even before our presidential election. I think October is a very big month because of the suspension or the end, really, of key arms restrictions on Iran are going to trigger in October. And the Trump administration is committed to preventing that. And so before October, before our election, there will be some Iran crisis. And it may drag in key states in the Gulf. It may drag in Iraq. The Iranians will use asymmetric power to try to influence us. They're doing that in the waters of the Gulf now, because we've issued new rules of engagement. They'll move someplace else. They'll move back to Iraq, or they'll move to another venue. But I think that the Iran face-off is going to escalate in the next several months, and that is likely to occur just as we begin to get round 2 of the coronavirus, which will dominate capitals throughout the region, including our own. So this, I think, is quite a combustible situation. Let me stop there. There's a lot of other topics to go into, but I think that's enough for food for thought.
Yeah, let me also maybe, comment a bit. If we look at the regional competition, you might say a while back it was a time of ambition, and now it's a time of contrition, to be contrite and not to think that you're going to be such a big winner. The US in 2003 had the ambition of changing the entire Middle East and creating a whole US Pax Americana in the Middle East. That failed. President Erdogan in 2011 thought he would inherit the post-Arab Spring Middle East and would preside over sort of a Muslim Brotherhood-led set of countries in the region. Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, when he first emerged, I think greatly over-interpreted his capacity and the power of Saudi Arabia with adventures in Yemen, position on Qatar, position on Lebanon, but now quite aware that he has other priorities. And whereas I do think maybe the Iranian leadership certainly is still stuck where it was, I would say 30, 40 years ago, and has not changed its perspectives, there is no doubt that the Iranian public before this, but certainly in the next, the pressures of the next months and years will be going in a direction which does not encourage great regional ambitions. So I think right now in 2020, we've inherited the wreckage of multiple ambitions: American ambitions, Turkish ambitions, Iranian ambitions, and Saudi ambitions. But I do see, with the contraction of the economy, and everybody's going to be worried about their domestic situation, I see opportunities for de-escalating regional conflict, and I've already talked about them, and I would just leave that on the table. With regard to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, in a way, it's over and at one level, in the sense that annexation is going to proceed. The so-called peace deal was neither peaceful nor a deal. There is no potential for a two-state solution that I can see. Israel is locked into a binational apartheid, type military occupation state for the rest of the 21st century. That means for Israel, it's either insurgencies or domestic disturbance or civil war, things of that nature. At the same time, I think you can also say that the Israeli-Arab conflict doesn't exist anymore. Israel is really not in conflict with any Arab state. It has peace with some and a cold peace with others. Even those who claim to be in conflict, like Syria, obviously is not. You can say the only one is Iran and its proxies. So the Israeli-Arab conflict is no longer a determinant factor. And I see a very dim future for the Palestinians because the Israelis are not offering anything reasonable. And the Arabs really are not neither engaged in supporting the Palestinians or actually, I would say, engaged negotiating with the Israelis to get a better deal for the Palestinians. And one of the big failings of Arab diplomacy, I feel, A, is lack of unity and coordination, obviously. But secondly, such a dependence on the West. We have a problem with Iran, so please, Mr. Bush, please, Mr. Obama, please, Mr. Trump, take care of it. We have a problem with Israel, please, Mr. Jared Kushner, please, Mr. So-and-so, fix it for us. We have a problem with Turkey, we won't talk with Turkey because we disagree with it. Please, Putin, Vladimir, talk to him, somebody talk to him. I think Arab diplomacy needs to be much more visionary, much more proactive, much more tough, but also much more proactive in how it tries to change its own region and stop depending on global powers. For Egypt, which you obviously wisely asked about, Egypt, there are many elephants in the room. Egypt is the biggest. Too big to fail, yes, but it has elements of great strain and it could fail. Now, the failure could be partial, like you see in Pakistan or like you see in some other big countries. Certainly, Egypt is entering a period of much more intense stress for the obvious reasons of economic contraction, collapse of tourism, inability to go get about. And I fear in 2020, as the virus proceeds, will it really take an enormous toll in Egypt or not? At this point, I guess it's very difficult to predict, but Egypt is under an enormous amount of strain. I would say on the positive sense that the Egyptian government and many of its economic and social ministries are very impressively proactive. And I've met with a number of them and I've seen the many activities that they're doing. So they are trying hard, but the country is so huge, the growth rate is so fast, and the economic burdens are so enormous that one must fear for Egypt. I think for the Gulf, that means even though the Gulf is going through difficult times, you've got to keep an eye on Egypt, as does the world. You have to help out in order to make sure that it doesn't collapse or it doesn't half collapse.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sam.
Thank you. So I have a question, maybe two questions, because also I need to take some of the audience question. The first one, Rob, what would be the impact of this crisis on amending or changing already approved development plans in the MENA regions? And what are the most flexible countries in responding to these changes? The other question, what are the lessons and opportunities that the MENA countries can take advantages of as a result of the coronavirus crisis?
Well, if I may jump in on that, I think obviously all development plans have been impacted. and will continue to be impacted for the obvious reasons that the economies have ground to a halt, are likely to contract, commerce cannot be transacted, the global economy is frozen, tourism has stopped. So obviously everybody's development plan has been completely upended. Now, the orientation where these development plans have to be amended, some of them are being amended in that direction. I've hinted at a few issues. One is to build resilient economies. In other words, economies that don't simply focus on growth, but economies that focus on resilience, on the ability to withstand enormous shocks like the ones we have. What does that mean? That means that within each country, you have to look at the nature of the economy, the essential businesses, and give them priority, like food security, the food chain, health provision, return to provision of education so that we don't lose more generations, providing of social support and cash transfer for low-income groups at a time when new jobs are not going to be created and when the economy is not going to grow. So development plans have to be much more inclusive, much more oriented towards human security, social inclusion, and social justice. In addition, there are some sectors which might benefit. Some sectors which might benefit include the technology sector. Technology, if anything, is being used much more now than it was used before. Technology is much more required in the education sector and in the health sector than it was before. Many of the Arab countries were waiting for an opportunity to be more active in the tech sector and grow that sector. Certainly, it's an opportunity for countries to invest in these sectors because they are actually providing a way for the economy to keep going at a time when physically you cannot go back and forth. In terms of international trade, that has not been, now it's been affected in the sense that the global economy has contracted, but it's still happening.
Give a chance to Rob to give us also his view on that.
Yes, ma'am. To Rob.
Rob, please.
Look, just on the development question, I think a lot of the countries in the region are in trouble. I mean, I think governments are going to be looking at budgets and saying, what can we cut? What is absolutely necessary for us to spend on? And governments are going to be forced to make decisions about priorities that are difficult, painful, and politically costly. Most governments would like to kick these down the road, and it'll be extremely difficult if you have to run budget. The scope of budget deficits that we're now going to see in Saudi Arabia and other countries in the region are just astronomical, and so things will have to be sped up on one level, but big projects that were meant to be transformative are going to have to be slowed down. So I think we're going to see a very serious dislocation in government development plans and government-run economies in the region.
Okay. I would take also another question for you, Rob, but this is what would be the impact of this crisis, I would say now, or how would be the post-coronavirus global shifts, especially the nature of relationship between US and China, reflect on the MENA region? Rob? Rob?
Well, it's a very good question. I know there's a lot of anxiety about the Chinese making inroads into the Middle East. I actually don't have the same level of anxiety. It's not as though the Chinese are offering that much to many Middle Eastern countries. A plane load of defective PPE is not going to shift the geostrategic position of China in any of these countries. The real question will still be in Washington. Do we escape the world, or and the institutions that we think are flawed, or do we try to repair them? And repairing them is a big job. It will require investment and focus and time and money. And it is not a foregone conclusion that even an internationalist president will get broad national consensus on repairing these flawed international institutions. Now, it's in that vacuum that I fear that China can take advantage. But again, it'll be a function of a decision we make, not because of losing out in some competition in Riyadh or Baghdad or Amman or Cairo.
Zaid, do you have the last question? Then we take some question from the audience.
All right, so we're doing all time because it's almost 10
or
11.
Yeah, we can take a short question and then we.
All right, I'll keep it very short and to the point. Thank you both. Actually, this is again fantastic. My concern is about we've been identifying some cultural value attitudes changes, if you wish, especially because of some religious reasons. And some people are predicting new waves and new modalities of radicalization in the region. Now, if that is to be combined with poverty and distrust and the trust gap and all other issues, then the going back to the violent extremism is a potential of this future, the future of this region. Would you agree to that, Paul and Rob?
Yeah, in brief, I mean, to be very brief, yes. I mean, the risk is definitely there when you have more and more people desperate and looking for a way to express themselves or to get ahead. Certainly, that's an opportunity for radical groups. But it's also an opportunity for regular criminal groups or regular armed gangs. So I don't necessarily think it's always the ideological groups that will take advantage. It might be other groups. In addition, we have to also track the amount of financial capacity that these groups had. For a while, they had access to a lot of money. I think that access has been greatly restricted. For a while, the governments of the region did not have enough vigilance and enough knowledge and expertise to combat them. I think they've come a long way. So I think conditions are different. But yes, it's certainly a risk among several risks that exist.
Thank you.
I will turn to the audience questions, and there's a question, maybe Rob, you can take it. This is from Dr. Abdul Khaliq Abdullah. The UAE seized the corona crisis to send urgent medical aids to Iran. How do you read this?
I think the Emirates has had quite a number of humanitarian and other outreaches to Iran over, even in the midst of geopolitical conflict with Iran. The trade between different Emirates and Iran continues despite political disputes. I think this is part of that rather complex and subtle UAE strategy regarding Iran.
Thank you. Paul, there is a question from Dr. Karrar Abbas. He is an academician from Iraq, and he says, what is the impact of corona pandemic on the future of regional balance in Middle East?
Well, I mean, I think I've expressed my views a little bit. I would say, maybe agreeing with Robert, that it doesn't necessarily have an immediate impact, because the leaders are continuing in their habits and their decisions that were taken years before, and they're unlikely to change very quickly. But I would say the impact of this COVID crisis, which could go on for years and be historically very profound, certainly creates pressures in Turkey, in Iran, in Saudi Arabia, which are maybe the key players in the region in that aspect, to move away from spending money on regional conflict and move towards prioritizing domestic matters. So I think that a great opportunity exists. To link it a little bit to the question that was just asked about Iran, I mean, Iran, before this crisis, was suffering tremendously economically, partly because of oil prices, which were below already, and partly because of the Trump sanctions. Now it's suffering much, much more. That means that any leadership, to my mind, in Iran, in Tehran, in 2021 is going to be under a lot of pressure to find a way out. Now, whether that's with a second Trump administration or a new Biden administration, and ideally that would include the Gulf countries participating in such a tough negotiation. But we have a chance to end these decades of mindless conflict, which are just lose-lose situations.
Just on this point, that's all. I agree with the rationality of what Paul just said. I regret when I look at the actual decisions and actions of the Iranian leadership that they lack that same rationality that Paul just described. In fact, they are spending just about as much money on sort of negative stuff as they did when they had more money, even though they have a lot less money today. I would love to see the Iranians reprioritize to address their domestic needs. That would be a really positive sign. I just don't think we see a lot of it yet.
Rationality is culturally conditioned, right?
Well, it sort of depends. You know, if you're trying to teach your child not to put their hand on the stove, I don't think it matters whether they're Muslim, Christian, Jewish, whatever. It's just the rational thing to do.
Iranian, it's different. I'm just joking. I don't know if you have more questions.
I will take, I think this is the last question we can take because of the time. It says from Muhammad Saifullah, will states in the MENA region, whether the Gulf or North Africa, will increase their public spending on healthcare and associated sectors, or they will keep prioritizing spending on defense and security? What do you think, both of you?
Well, again, it's a question of what the pressures make them do and what they might actually do. I mean, reading the crisis, there's no doubt that the crisis forces or puts enormous pressure on governments. They absolutely have to spend in the public health sector. They have no choice. They absolutely have to spend more on social safety nets, or else they will have enormous explosions. Now, how do they manage that while also loving to spend on the military and other things? Is that problem that decision makers who are trying to build budgets will have to face. I would say the governments of the region are going to have to make these tough choices at a time when it's going to be very difficult to borrow money because there's not going to be much appetite for that either. So I think the pressure is to spend more on domestic, but we'll see if the leaders do that.
I hope that's the case. Maybe I'm just a little more cynical. I think that the opportunity for enhanced surveillance of people to make sure that they're abiding by quarantines and lockdowns sounded awfully attractive to people who run mukhabarats around the region. And we're going to have, I think, increased spending on domestic intelligence. Hopefully, this moves away from some foreign adventure. That, I think, is in many countries is a real possibility. I'd like to see more spending on health and education and social welfare. I think we're likely to see a lot of big symbolic projects that governments can point to as being evidence of their commitment on these issues. I'm not so sure we're going to see as dramatic shifts in budgets that reflect those sorts of symbolic spending on these topics.
Well, I cannot skip this question. It is from Hiwa Osman from Iraq and from Kurdistan. Say, how do you see the U.S.-Iraq policy after COVID-19, and what would the U.S. do if Iran does its favorite game of controlling Iraq?
Rob, I'll leave that to you.
Well, look, you know, we're having this discussion at a moment of uncertainty, but I would say a moment of hope in Iraq. We're in the middle of the formation of the new government. The new prime minister and his team are a very impressive group of Iraqi nationalists with great. Very talented group. These are not under the thumb of the United States. They are Iraqi nationalists, which is, I think, precisely what we as the United States should want. But this is the third try at having a prime minister since the last election. You know, if the Iraqis can't achieve it, you know, it will have an impact on the relationship over time. So I'm hopeful that that we can get a government that is firm and strong, that can do the job for the Iraqi people, and I'd like to think that that we will be there to support them in that effort. But if the Iraqis can't get their own house together, it's difficult for them to expect the United States is going to be there to shore up a house that is falling.
Rob, Paul, Zaid, thank you so much. It's been a wonderful discussion, and I think our viewers and followers enjoyed that fruitful discussion. And also thanks for all of those who have been following us either on our YouTube channel or on social media. And we promise you, we come back to you again on another topic, exciting topic, of course. Thanks a lot for all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.